Omar Baddar. He is a member of the National Policy Council for the Arab American Institute. Omar, thank you so much for being with us. What stood out to you from what you heard there from President Trump and King Abdullah?
What really stood out is the incredible arrogance with which Donald Trump is speaking about Palestinians. He's talking about how he and a group of other people get to decide where Palestinians live, rather than actually allowing Palestinians to make that decision for themselves about whether they stay in their own land or not. And you have all this rhetoric about how he's no longer even talking about buying Gaza. He's just going to take it, and no one is going to question it. I mean, just the level to which he's detached from reality it's really hard to put into words. The entire world questions under what authority Trump is allowing himself to basically take ownership of Gaza. It's completely bonkers. And the fact that it's framed as concern for Palestinians, I think, is what's most distasteful about those comments. Because the only reason why Gaza has become unlivable is because the United States has allowed Israel to destroy Gaza in atrocities that are documented by every major human rights organization in the world now, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, both describing Israel's onslaught in Gaza as genocidal. If you want Palestinians to be able to live, all you have to do is basically put an end to that onslaught and allow them to live as a free people in their own land. But that seems to be off the table for Donald Trump, who is choosing instead to fulfill Netanyahu's worst fantasies about emptying Palestine of any Palestinians for Israel to take over the entire territory.
I do wonder, Omar, how you would then approach the issue of Hamas, because as you know, they're threatening to delay the release of these hostages over the weekend. Trump and Netanyahu both seem inclined to restart hostilities if Hamas delays that hostage release. Clearly, they want a future where that group, a terrorist group, is not in Gaza's future. So how do you reconcile those two ideas?
Yeah, what Netanyahu and Trump want is the defeat of Hamas, something they have not been able to achieve militarily on the ground, and now they're trying to force through negotiations once more, saying either Hamas accepts its total defeat or else we're going back to the onslaught that, again, nobody says is actually targeted at Hamas. Nobody's serious, certainly. Everybody talks about this as an assault on the entire Palestinian population of Gaza and making Gaza unlivable as punishment until Hamas capitulates and buckled. And what we're seeing right now is clearly an effort by Israel, seeing that they finally have in Donald Trump an endorsement of this idea of displacing Palestinians. Israel has lost any interest in that ceasefire, and they're looking for an excuse and a reason for it to fall apart, which is why we've seen dozens of Palestinians get killed throughout the so-called ceasefire, why we're seeing Israel drag its feet on moving to the next phase of negotiations that could turn that ceasefire into a permanent ceasefire. All of that is deliberately designed to force Hamas's hand to basically make it so that Hamas cannot comply without seemingly completely giving in to Israel's wishes in violation of those terms. And that does mean that we're effectively imminently going back to hostilities that are aiming to displace Hamas from the picture entirely. And the issue is that there is a double standard with which we look at this, is that if Hamas is disqualified from being in Gaza because of the atrocities they've committed in Israel, and certainly they have committed atrocities, there's no denying that, why isn't the opposite true? Why aren't the far infinitely greater atrocities that the Israeli government has committed in Gaza disqualifying of the Israeli government remaining in power? And that's what we're looking at here, is a situation of dominance in which Israel gets to impose its will on the Palestinians, and they seemingly have Trump's complete endorsement in pursuing that, and that is not a recipe for peace. If we're actually looking for a way in which we resolve this crisis, we have to start recognizing that Palestinians are equal human beings who are deserving of the same dignity and freedom that Israelis enjoy, and that requires a fundamentally different approach from the United States towards this entire issue, in which we do start demanding that Israel abide by international law and recognize Palestinians as people who deserve to be free in their own land.
I am curious, Omar, how you then respond to the argument that we would not be here at this stage were it not for Hamas's atrocities on October 7th. That the reason this war began, the reason this war has been carried out this way, you'll hear from folks who defend Netanyahu and the IDF, is because of Hamas.
I mean, there's no question that the expansion of Israel's onslaught in Gaza was triggered by October 7th and what Hamas did on that day. But we have to remember that the conflict did not start on that day. There was no freedom or security for Palestinians on October 6th. We've had the entire Gaza Strip under Israeli siege, no relationship with the outside world, no connection to the outside world. Palestinians in Gaza were not allowed to leave Gaza or visit any other country in the world unless they had Israeli permission to do so. The economy was collapsed, unemployment was through the roof. It was, again, a situation of dominance in which Palestinians were living under the boot of Israeli siege and occupation. And if that's an acceptable status quo, then by all means, that's something that you can then decide to blame on Hamas for having rocked. But that is an unsustainable situation. There's no situation in which Palestinians can be denied freedom indefinitely, in which violence is not expected to explode. And if we are serious, once again, about resolving the core issue, if we're simply looking for a way to just trade blame, that's very easy to do, and we can do that going back for many, many decades. But if we're interested in solving the issue, you have to deal with the underlying problem, and the underlying problem that existed before October 7th is the fact that Palestinians have spent decades under illegal Israeli rule. The entire world, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, everybody agrees that that siege and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza are illegal. And you can't indefinitely place Palestinians under a foreign military occupation and expect for that situation to be sustainable.
Omar, I have one final question for you. As I heard Donald Trump there talking about some of the inroads that he made with Arab communities, I think he vastly overstated his support among Arabs. But you were someone who was frustrated with the Biden administration's approach to this conflict. And I understand you ultimately sat out the last election. Seeing now Trump's vision for the Middle East become more solid, become more imminent and real, do you have any regrets?
Yeah, I can't quite describe them as regrets. I mean, I understood that Trump was going to bring a worse outcome moving forward. But the reality is the reason why Donald Trump can say that Gaza is unlivable and there's nothing for Palestinians left there is because the Biden-Harris administration facilitated the utter destruction of Gaza for 15 months with unrelenting American weapons and diplomatic protection and support, and stepping in to block ceasefires and so on. So yes, certainly Trump has made things, and it seems to be priming us to an absolutely awful situation. But that was built on what the previous administration has done. And I think that the point here that is really worth emphasizing is that whereas the Biden administration supplied the weapons for Israel to do what it did in Gaza and to its people, killing tens of thousands of Palestinian children, there was all this grumbling about how we don't really approve and we're upset and we think Israel's killing too many people and we encourage calm. Whereas Donald Trump does not care about coming across as palatable. He will just openly say, essentially endorse what Israel's doing instead of pretending what it's not. Donald Trump comes along and basically says, yes, we are for the destruction of Palestinian society in Gaza and the displacement of Palestinians. But unfortunately, we have to really look at a longer period of dark American policy towards Israel and Palestine, in which we treat Israel like a country that is above the rules and above the law. And that facilitates the absolute outrages that Trump is proposing at this time.
Omar Baddar, we have to leave the conversation there. We appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective.